Hello and welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. So today I want to talk a bit about one of the teachings that's at the very heart of Buddhism, and that is that everything arises dependent on conditions and causes. Nothing can exist independent of the outside world. And it might seem a bit obvious when I say it like that, but nothing actually has intrinsic existence. Everything arises as a result of other things, and that includes us. We're all shaped by our environment. And if you think about yourself for a moment and what makes you what you are, you could possibly see yourself here today as the culmination of a whole infinite web of previous conditions. So there's the genes from your parents, the food and the air and the water that you've taken in, and also all the people you've met, all the conversations that you've had, all the books that you've absorbed, everything that you've learned over the years has made you what you are. And there's millions of ideas and millions of influences from people that you've encountered. And of course, previous traumas and triumphs, everything that's happened in your life has brought you to where you are today. Now in Buddhism we talk about emptiness, the idea that everything is empty. And the word in Pali is sunyata. Now emptiness doesn't mean that things don't exist. It simply means everything is the product of conditions and causes. And not just one cause, but many. So it means that we exist in the midst of a whole flow of phenomena, and we're part of that flow. So emptiness you might not think is the best word to use. Sunyata can also be translated as openness. And it also takes in the idea that nothing's permanent, nothing's fixed. Everything arises and at some point it disappears again. And things cease to exist when their supporting conditions are no longer present. So everything depends on everything else. And in a sense, everything contains everything else. And many of you might be familiar with the idea of Indra's net. So in the Huayan school of Buddhism, the universe is compared to an infinite net of jewels, and they're stretching out in all directions. So Indra's net has a jewel at each node, and the polished surface of each jewel reflects every other jewel. And of course, we talk about interconnectedness within modern science as well, the idea that we're part of a system. We talk about causality. But in our day-to-day lives, we're often inclined to oversimplify causality. So we see the chain of causality as being linear, just moving in one direction, one thing after another. And that's especially true when we're apportioning blame for something. We'll say it's your fault that this happened. Or indeed, if we're taking credit for something. But of course, in reality, life is a whole complex series of interactions. And we exist in a dynamic, interrelated system where everything is affected by everything else. And how we live affects other people, just as much as they affect us. So you can't necessarily attribute blame to one person for one thing. Most things happen as a result of all sorts of conditions. And we often act as if the world is made up of countless separate things. And most of the time we forget how much our lives are just bound up with those of other beings. And the sense of being a separate self obscures the truth, which is that we're part of one vast system. And the Zen Buddhist teacher Alan Watts once said, "You are something, not that comes into the world, but comes out of it. In the same way as a flower comes out of a plant, or a fruit comes out of a tree, you are an expression." And I think seeing reality in this way, as an infinitely vast net of interconnected phenomena, each one showing the influence of everything else, is to view the world through awakened eyes. And sometimes it's practical to think of ourselves as separate. This helps us to navigate the world. But if we could develop a deep appreciation of impermanence and interconnectedness, and if we can remember sometimes that we're part of something bigger, and we can handle that understanding alongside the more conventional sense of self, that can completely change our experience of the world. Because our sense of being a separate self is the part of us that worries and obsesses and compares. It's the part of us that's constantly dragging us into the past and into the future. And it also drives the voice that's constantly judging ourselves and judging others and comparing, just constantly comparing. And we make these judgments and then we believe them to be the truth. And often they're not true. Or else they're a pale imitation of the truth. Because our perception is inevitably coloured by conditions, particularly the state of our own heart and mind in that moment. And that's why in this practice, in the insight tradition, we're so interested in the state of our heart and our mind. And one of the practices that we have is metta practice. We talk about metta practice, it really means friendliness, kindness and friendliness. And we learn so much through the practice of metta. So when we cultivate a heart that's loving and open, we completely change the way that we perceive others. And they're no longer in our way. They're no longer out to get us, or they're no longer put on this earth to annoy us. We perceive them much more fully, much more completely. And we no longer see them purely in terms of whether they can help us or harm us. So our sense of self starts to fade into the background. The more we do this, the more obvious it becomes that the state of our heart and mind is what shapes our experience of being in the world. And that's why metta, that's why kindness and compassion can also be seen as insight practices. They provide us with insight into the nature of our minds. And they help us to see things differently. Our own past experiences condition our thoughts. And as I said, we end up thinking those thoughts are true and we categorize other people as good or bad. But our perception of others is absolutely dependent on our mind, and we only know them through the filter of that perception. So what we're seeing is not that person, it's a picture of that person that we've painted in the mind. And our perception is always going to be coloured in some way. So meditating and practicing metta means we can experiment with this, we can experiment with perception. We can practice seeing others, even people we don't know or people that we maybe had difficulty with, we can see them differently. Maybe see them in more positive ways. Maybe see them in more generous ways as well. So our past conditioning and our mental habits don't just dictate how we perceive other people, they actually shape how we experience the whole world. And this practice shows us that there are other ways of perceiving our world, much more open, flowing ways of perceiving our world. So sometimes it's necessary to see things differently. Sometimes it's really helpful to transcend our everyday consciousness. So the consciousness that we use to carry out everyday ordinary business, like checking our bank statement or shopping, that kind of consciousness is really important. It's essential. We couldn't function without it. But we also need to be able to remove ourselves from that ordinary thinking process in order to go more deeply into the teachings. And one way that we do this is by meditating. So we meditate not just to get peace and quiet. In meditating, we're actually training the mind to pierce our delusions. So whatever arises, whether it's calm or not, can actually help us to gain some insight into what we really are. And it helps us to see absolute reality behind the everyday reality. So before I started meditating, I never really questioned whether my thoughts were true or not. But when we meditate, we start to realize that the process of thinking can be quite arbitrary. It's often a bit meaningless. The meditation practice actually helps us to question thoughts that aren't particularly useful, and the kind of thoughts that make our lives miserable and stressful. So sometimes it's possible to see the world very differently within meditation. And you might notice if you practice meditation, you might experience a strong sense of oneness or a sense that there's a big universal awareness in which everything takes place. Maybe a sense of unity. And this is usually a temporary feeling. It's just a state that passes through us. And in time we fall back into more conventional ways of seeing the world. But if we can explore other ways of perceiving the world, this can sometimes penetrate right down into our delusions. It can really open things up in a way that rational thinking and concepts can't do. And there's other ways of looking at things differently. Poetry and art and music can really open our eyes and shift our perspective and take us to places that we wouldn't otherwise visit. We'll always need a healthy sense of self, and we'll always have our own unique identity. But we can actually practice ways of looking at the world that see it as being connected. We can see it as being one great system. And we can actually see emptiness, sunyata. And we don't have to focus on all this too intensely. It's about a kind of questioning of our thoughts. And we're cultivating a mind that doesn't have to know all the answers. Maybe cultivating a mind that can handle more than one way of seeing the world. That's what I wanted to talk about this week. And thank you for listening as always. And I hope you can join me again next week.